My name is Grace Berends, and I will be doing my presentation on the Ghost Mountain Boys, the 32nd Infantry Division during the Second World War. To start off, I would like to thank an old friend, Mr. Mark, for his personal interview and recollection of his father's personal encounters of this time period. But in this presentation, we'll go over a bit of the history and background of the division and how they're picked to go to New Guinea to fight the Japanese. From there, we'll look at General Douglas MacArthur and his accounts given by the veterans about him, as well as their main issue and the type of terrain and major geographical difficulties that these men faced. And finally, we'll talk about the natives and how they played a key role in the outcome of this epic battle and how it affected the war. Our first section is the background of the Ghost Mountain Boys. The 32nd Infantry had a majority of its men originating from Michigan and Wisconsin. We'll specifically talk about Mark's father, Stanley, especially in the WZZM interview, as well as the James Campbell interviews that created the Ghost Mountain Boys book. This regiment, along with the U.S. 2nd Battalion and the 126th Battalion, were to trek 130 miles across the Owen Stanley Mountains in Papua New Guinea, along with the help of the natives on the island. It was an effort to divert Japan from reaching Australia. The appropriately named Ghost Mountain Boys fought their way through Buna and Gona, and they picked this battalion due to several different factors. According to Don Stout's WZZM interview, he said, "They picked my battalion to go over the Owen Stanley Mountains just in case the Japanese were coming from the trail." The Japanese were anticipating an attack by sea, having much of their weaponry pointed in that direction. For the men to attack from west to east in the grueling terrain was what seemed completely impossible. The 32nd Infantry and the other regiments lacked basic survival skills, and they were untrained in jungle warfare, giving the men a very low morale from the start, as much would do if you were not ready for it. Along with their unprepared selves, the weather, like constant rain and fog and muddy conditions, created the perfect environment for malaria-ridden bugs, and this caused much disease and issues in the future. How they were chosen? Originally, the men who enlisted were supposed to be reserves for the ongoing war against the Axis powers in Europe. As the threat became more prominent and Japan's fortification of the greater East Asia came closer to Australia. After the bombing of Pearl Harbor, Curtin, the Australian politician, allied the Americans with the Australians, and with the demand of several Australian divisions to be sent back to protect their home country, it would jeopardize the British line with the Middle East. So with negotiations and major suggestions by Churchill, the 32nd Infantry Division, the Red Arrows, were chosen to assist the Australians in New Guinea. General Douglas MacArthur and who he was. General Douglas MacArthur was a commander-in-chief of the Southwest Pacific during the time of the 32nd Infantry was sent to New Guinea. Under his order, the men from Michigan and Wisconsin were taken to San Francisco to load to the Far East. According to Mr. Mark, the men were in wool winter uniforms prior to their switch placements. Due to the quick changes in plans, they were not issued new uniforms, and they were sent to the super hot, humid island to fight in the clothes that temperatures were well over 100 degrees Fahrenheit. In a sense, the clothes pretty much just rotted right off of them. General Douglas MacArthur was regarded as one of the most brilliant generals who commanded the Allied troops in the Pacific during World War II, and thought to be one of the best generals to ever serve in the United States Army. Unfortunately, based on some accounts of the men who served under him, especially during the New Guinea campaign, he was seen to be very egotistical and did not account for how many men died in his command. In the James Campbell book, The Ghost Mountain Boys, he explains early in the book on page 16 of the intro that the casualties of Buna were considerably higher than the Guadalcanal. The Guadalcanal had 1,100 troops who were killed, with 4,350 wounded, and the cost of New Guinea's casualties were 3,300 killed with 5,500 wounded. He then includes a staggering quote by William Manchester. The difference in size of the attacking forces is taken into account. The loss of life in Papua New Guinea had been 3 times as great as the Guadalcanal. Douglas MacArthur was also a 5-star general who had a large amount of his military background. For instance, his father was an Army officer in the Western Frontier. He graduated top of his class in the United States Military Academy at West Point. During World War II, he was stationed in the Philippines, and from there he served in various other regiments and received promotions. During World War II, he was originally the commander in the U.S. Army forces in the Far East, but his Air Force was destroyed due to the surprise attack by the Japanese, and after retreating to Bataan Peninsula, President Franklin Roosevelt ordered MacArthur's family and staff to flee to Australia. Shortly after the 32nd was sent to New Guinea under his command, this created the island hopping campaign in the Pacific. Given his military background and achievements, the men who fought under him would have the understanding and training that would best serve their mission and duty. With my General Douglas MacArthur continued, I have various thoughts done by the Berends. The main opinions on General Douglas MacArthur were not within favor of him. Virtually none of the men going over the Stanley Owen Mountains had anything good to say about him. An article done by WZZM portrayed this, and the interviews that were done completely blew the concept of how brilliant this general was. Though there was much success in his career, the death toll does pay heavy. Mr. Mark states that we won the war in spite of him, not because of him. He had this huge ego and talked about the men being so important, but for him, they were just cannon fodder. Due to his methods, he was also a controversial figure in the United States during and after the war. The objective for this epic march. The main mission for this march was to take back Port Moresby, Gona, and Buna, and to rid the Japanese of the island. This was found quite difficult and near impossible because the Japanese were already stationed there, and their bunkers were built with the machine guns pointed. Though they were anticipating a sea invasion, their already made settlement made it quite grueling. MacArthur's plan to come by land would result in a 130-mile trek in just 42 days, consisting of hot, humid weather to fight the Japanese. A quote done also by Mark was that no one in their right mind would have thought to be attacked like this. The terrain for the march. Besides fighting the war, the terrain that still exists in Papua New Guinea created a whole new battle. The dense jungle, towering peaks, deep valleys, and fatigued swamps were only part of the issue. When you put into effect the high elevation, the fog, cloud coverage, that was all due to the constant rain, humidity, and sweltering heat, it does not even cover the difficulties. Due to the harshness of this terrain, many men's uniforms were tattered and stained, pretty much just rotting off of them. Very few wore socks and underwear because of the ill preparedness. Malaria-ridden bugs that would have almost all the soldiers extremely sick with vomiting, diarrhea, and body shakes. In the Ghost Mountain Boys book, Leonard Still is quoted, "All those who were alive were so near death. In the beginning of this campaign, we were all young, healthy GIs, eager to conquer the world. In the matter of weeks, long before we even met our enemy force, all of us had been transformed into ghosts of our former selves." Hardships due to the terrain. As stated in the previous slide, there were many hardships that resulted from the terrain. The men suffered from jungle rot, malaria, fever, dysentery, ringworm, dehydration, heat prostration, as well as exhaustion. These men would also suffer from post-traumatic stress disorder, or PTSD, due to the days of their fighting. On the account of Stanley, on WZZM, a lot of the time I'd wake up in the middle of the night and I'd think, I hope I have my rifle in my hand. I'm thinking back into the jungle again and want to make sure I've got my protection. Due to what they witnessed in their gruesome fight, many of the men who survived could not contest their stress after the war was well over. The loss of uniform due to environmental factors also created hardship for the soldiers. The uniform essentially decayed off of their bodies due to the weather, thus leaving the men more vulnerable to disease, infection, and other issues. The next factor that will be included is the excessive amount of fog and cloud coverage. These factors made visibility quite difficult and create much havoc in the march. Groups of men would become lost on their mission, splitting off the platoons or just straying from the rendezvous point. This coverage also made it very difficult to find the enemies in a sense of blindsiding soldiers with a shot or an encounter. The hardest one was the death. Death was the main issue that arose during the battle. Over half of the United States soldiers in this campaign were killed as part of the casualties count. On the enemy side, more than 2,200,000 Japanese soldiers would lose their lives in the Papua New Guinea campaign. Unfortunately, with the large mass of wounded and dead, many of these men were left or to be carried by the natives. Also in the WZZM article, Russell By states that the Japanese would get killed and they would not be able to take care of their bodies. They'd lay there and the flies would come in. Maggots would go all over them and make an awful smell. These conditions also created hazardous scenes and fed into much of their PTSD that would be held for the remainder of their lives. Along with witnessing the enemies dying, many of the close-up companions and fellow soldiers were also killed around these men due to the heavy fire, shrapnel, and other factors of war. The native assistance and how they helped. Originally, no white men had been to New Guinea, so the maps were quite sketchy. The inability to do reconnaissance because the planes were shot down by the Japanese also left the men who arrived just guessing in the direction of travel. If it weren't for the natives, the men may not have won the war. Port Moresby in Papua New Guinea was a key Allied transition point in Australia, and it controlled the islands. The natives very rarely received credit for their actions that majorly contributed to the end of the war. The natives knew everything about the jungle and terrain that was involved in getting to the port, Buna, and Gona. They were extremely helpful. They carried the Allied troops' gear, their wounded, assisted in being stretcher bearers. They were also very passive and did not do any of the fighting. They brought the men through the roughs of the Kokoda trek, the same trail that the Japanese took originally. This trail was originally used as the hunting trail by the natives, and it went pretty much through the middle of the Owen Stanley Mountains. The natives also majorly contributed to the ending of the war. When the Papuan campaign reached its climax in January 1943, the Allies had captured Buna. They successfully took Buna, Port Moresby, and various other key sites to ensure Australia's protection from Japan. Along with the successful campaign, it boosted everyone's morale because it dislodged the myth that Japan was invincible. The natives assisted with much of the success by bringing the wounded soldiers to the doctors, allowing them to fight again or to go home to reconnect with their relatives and loved ones. Though they did not receive enough credit for this, many of the men carry their gratitude and remembrance with those who made the impossible possible. Just a small contribution to the remembrance of the natives. I did find in an Australian article about it that the natives were also called the Fuzzy Wuzzy Angels, and they were given this inspirational poem showing how their deeds allowed the soldiers to return home again or to fight. So many a lad will see his mother and the husbands, wee ones, and wives, just because the Fuzzy Wuzzy carried them to save their lives. For mortar bombs, machine gun fire, or just a chance surprise attack, to safety and the care of doctors at the bottom of the track. Many of the mothers in Australia, when they offer up a prayer, mention those impromptu angels with the fuzzy wuzzy hair. The 32nd Infantry post-New Guinea War. The Ghost Mountain Boys secured Buna, reaching the original objective. Though the casualties were high, and for both sides, these regiments were able to defeat the Japanese and build the morale for future battles. They dislodged the myth that Japan was invincible, thus supporting the future island-hopping excursions that would inevitably result in Japan's formal surrender. Following the War of Buna, the men would continue to fight and capture the Guadalcanal, fully securing the island and ensuring that the security of Australia's continent and American supply line to it. Many of the men who survived this campaign would also be transferred to Europe to continue to fight against the Axis powers until the ending of the war in 1945. And just to wrap some things up, I did make a small timeline just to kind of outline what happened. So in March 1942, the Japanese forces landed on the northern coast of the territory of Papua in an attempt to reach its capital, Port Moresby. In October 1942, General Douglas MacArthur ordered 1,200 untrained, poorly equipped American troops from the 32nd Infantry to cross the New Guinea's Papuan Peninsula. In November 1942, the soldiers arrived on the north coast battlefields of Buna and Sanananda. In January 1943, the 32nd Infantry Division was able to dislodge the Japanese from the coast, and this made the trek up, and the Japanese troops evacuated the Guadalcanal, leaving the island in Allied possession in February 1943. I also included much of the records and honors that the 32nd Infantry Division received. For instance, they did 654 days of combat, which was more than any other division in the war. They had 15,696 hours of combat, which was more than any U.S. division in any war, and 40% of that time was in World War II, along with 11,500 Purple Hearts. And an interesting fact is that the 32nd is still in service today. They are stationed out of Holland, Michigan today. And for my last slide, I included a complete list of Muskegon County's Red Arrow veterans from World War II that were around here. And it was out of courtesy of Richard Mullally, Muskegon War Historian, to include this on my article that I found on WZZM. So it was an honor so much to learn about this, as well as to learn more about these men, and I do very much appreciate your critique.